They teach the tale as if it were simple. The old kings fell, a new king rose, and by his hand House Targaryen was banished. The door to the 7 kingdoms slammed and barred. The sea itself declared a wall. I believed it once. Most of us do when we first put on gray and heft a quill, for simplicity is a sweet draught. Yet the truth, as the truth so often is in matters of kings and councils, spreads like a river over stones, forked and silted, pooling here and vanishing there, leaving behind the bones of fish and the glimmer of lost coins. If there was banishment, where is the warrant? If there was a warrant, who sealed it and what words were chosen? If banishment is a term of law, what law held, when the very notion of who may make law had been bloodied on a riverbank and dragged through the streets of a burning city? Allow me, then, to go slowly. The word banishment means something when a lord bids a troublesome knight quit his lands and not return upon pain of forfeiture. It means something else when the crown forces a queen to take ship for Lys and names her sons strangers to the realm. But when people say the banishment of House Targaryen, they pretend as if a single bell tolled, and the realm turned its back at once, as if all the power of the past 3 centuries could be shucked off like a glove. I have searched for that bell. I have not found it. What I have found are edicts about forfeitures, proclamations concerning peace and rebellion, private letters regarding the pursuit of certain personages of a particular name, sermons rehearsing old arguments about incest and divine displeasure, and tallies recording coin paid to hard-eyed men who swore they had seen a pale-haired boy on a Braavosi quay. In the aggregate, they look like banishment. Laid out one by one, they resemble a house built piecemeal, room upon room without a single ground plan except the rough necessity of keeping out weather and wolves. The realm in the year after the Trident was a body with broken bones set and reset before the swelling had passed. The armies were unmoored, the old loyalties tangled, the faith eager, the small council wary. The gullies cut by those weeks still mark our hills. I do not rehearse the battles for their own sake, only to show the temper of those who would later write or seal on the matter of exile. A prince had died in a river, a city had been entered by a fresh alliance, a king had fled, and a queen had become a mother on an island in a sudden storm. The words that came after were spoken over men who had not slept and by men who had only just learned to speak together. Had there been no sack, perhaps the tone of the first royal proclamations would have been more measured. Had there been fewer corpses, perhaps the word mercy would not have needed so many qualifiers. The air itself in those first months was a pretext. Hotter here, colder there, and every scribe who uncorked an inkwell was in some part settling an old score. The political context that birthed the so-called banishment has 2 pillars and several flying buttresses, and that architectural fact matters. First, there was the matter of legitimacy, and second, the matter of security. Legitimacy is too often treated as a scholar's game, but when banners are unfurled, its arguments decide, more than steel sometimes, whether 10,000 men stand or slink away. It was necessary, to those who had raised the stag, that it be clear to all that the dragon's fire was no longer lawful fire. Yet legitimacy could not be proved by daydreams. It had to be spoken by voices that people would follow. Thus the High Septon's declaration in the September of Baelor, where he affirmed the new king's right and, as Septon Omer wrote to his abbot in Old Town, spoke with delicacy of the old line's errors, naming the coupling of kin an affront to the mother that made unfit their heirs. If one reads Omer faithfully, as I have, one sees that the faith attempted to decouple the condemnation of incest from the condemnation of the crown entire. In other words, it was safer for the faith to speak of the Targaryens as sinners than to speak of them as outlaws. For sin can be washed with penance, but outlawry requires rope. Security, however, has no patience for penance. A child of the dragon alive across the sea is a rallying point, especially if coin and names are sticky on him like burrs. Lords who had bent the knee would need, for the first years, to be convinced that their bending had not gone astray. Ambassadors who had been alien to one another, Aerie and Casterly Rock, Storm's End and Highgarden, had learned to speak out of one mouth, and the mouth could not afford a tremor. It is in this climate that the earliest letters of interdiction appear. A raven from the Red Keep to Gulltown, preserved by happenstance in the Aries copybooks after a fire in the King's Archivum, instructs the port's master to detain all persons suspected to be agents or kindred of the deposed dragon, and to send immediate word to the hand if any bearers of that style or blood are seen to pass. The phrase "deposed dragon" is of interest. It treats the house as if it were a banner, not a lineage, and avoids the name. The avoidance continues in a letter to White Harbor, wherein the master of ships relays the crown's will that none issue safe conduct to the seed of contraries. That euphemism becomes common for a season, perhaps to spare ears already rubbed raw, seed of contraries, meaning the blood at odds with the peace. In those months, the work of law marched alongside the work of keeping men fed and roads patrolled, and it is not always clear which work governed the other. There was no great council convened to decide the fate of the old royal house, as there had been a century and a half before to decide succession in a different crisis. To convene such a body would have been to risk admitting that the matter was open. Instead, a small circle of men wrote with broad pens. He hands letters read as if they were praises sung to a compromise, and the Grand Maester's slips of language reveal a man who remembers yesterday's titles. Pycelle, in a memorandum copied by his clerk and circulated to sheriffs of the Crownlands, calls the former queen by that style rather than princess, then scratches the word to an illegible smear. I am told by a young scribe who was told by an old one that the smear was in the original. It is trivial on its face. It is instructive on its face too. The law prefers clarity. Where the record is smudged, power usually was also. As for edicts, 2 documents deserve the name even as they fell short of being the bell I sought. The first is the proclamation on the King's Peace, affixed with the stag and crown seal in the first spring after the war, publicly read in the square at Old Town, Lannisport, White Harbor, and more than a dozen smaller towns with a sheriff to unroll parchment. Its heart was this: that the war was at an end, that levies were to be disbanded, that the realm's peace carried the same penalties it had always carried under long-established custom, that the rebels were pardoned save for those who had committed acts beyond pardon, and that any man raising the dragon again upon a spear would be in arms against the peace. Notice what it does and does not do. It does not name House Targaryen. It does not forbid any man from bearing a certain hair, a certain eye, but it makes a symbol illegal, and in a land where symbols do more work than mice, that is near to the same thing. Septon Bereth, writing in his Lives of the Septons, claims the proclamation sounded the dragon's funeral bell. But Bereth writes for victory, not precision. The second document is harder. It exists in fragments in 3 copies made by 3 different hands. The so-called Writ of Summerhall, named for the place where it was allegedly drafted during a royal progress, declares the complete forfeiture of all lands, incomes, and titles held in the name and right of the Dragon Kings. I have seen only the fragment that concerns the island of Dragonstone and its dependencies, for which the writ provides grant to the Lord of Storm's End, and a separate fragment concerning certain offices of the city of King's Landing, their titles to be remade by the Crown. None of the fragments mentions persons, only holdings. The fragment that touches Dragonstone is consistent with what later comes to be, for the island passed to the king's brother and his line, though the exact tongue of passage was never copied into the Red Book of the Crown, at least not in the copy we possess after the sack. A steward of Storm's End told a Septon, who told his nephew, who told me, that the grant to Storm's End named the island a bulwark of the narrow sea, and commended its stern order. Such rhetoric hints at the larger goal of the writ: tidy the map and the revenues that pay for tidiness. There is no banishment there. There is rather, if you will permit the image, a sweeping of a table so new plates may be set. Already you feel the shape of the thing, I trust. Banishment, as a word, lives mostly in the mouths of later singers, in the testimony of men who wished their grandfathers had been more decisive or more merciful, depending upon the singer. Our closest witnesses, the contemporary letters and proclamations, are more careful or more coy. That is not to say harshness was lacking. If one needs harshness, one need only look to the bounties posted in the ports, which I have read in copies and in ledgers. 10 gold dragons for the capture of any man claiming the name Targaryen, 30 for one proven to be so by the hand's leave. Lesser sums for acquaintances and hirelings. A magistrate in Duskendale records paying 4 crowns to a man who named his neighbor a whisperer for pale heads, which shows us how quickly fear can be minted into bad coin. In Bravos, the Sea Lord's notary noted a visit from envoys of the new king, who requested that the free cities detain certain named fugitives and return them by ship to the custody of the crown. The notary adds dryly that bravos made answer in the accustomed manner, which is to say courteously and unhelpfully. These measures, while not called banishment, function as such. They make return impossible without a neck, and they make the seas the only remaining road. But the legal mind wants a threshold, and the political mind wants a date. Here our lines of ink begin to snipe at one another. The White Book of the Kingsguard, whose silence is often as eloquent as its words, records on a page now blotched with what looks like oil that Sir Willem escorted the Queen beyond the narrow sea. It does not add pursued by decree, or forbidden by proclamation. In a private letter that remains in the possession of House Redwine, the Lord of the Arbor grumbles that the small council asks for what the seas cannot enforce and will not pay for what the realm cannot stomach. His bluntness is a gift. What does the crown ask? The hunting of fugitives in lands not under its sway. What will it not pay for? The kind of purses that can pin men in crowded alleys and ship them gagged in holds. A man of the Arbor knows what sailors will and will not do. The letter is dated the second moon of the year after the war, which tells us that already by that time the crown was thinking beyond proclamations into practice. Now as to sources, there are two that disagree so violently that to lay them side by side is to learn more than either alone could teach. One is a chronicle compiled within the Red Keep by clerks who served under the Grand Maester, a work of summaries and abstracts of royal actions, meant to be a pillar for those who come after. The other is a set of letters written by a scribe at Sunspear to his brother, who kept an inn on the Boneway, a man who took news as he took guests, asking few questions and storing much. The Red Keep's chronicle claims that in the first winter of the new reign, the king, in mercy, permitted the departure of any of the deposed house who wished to quit the realm on condition that they never return. Note the feel of it. A gracious act, a clemency. The Sunspear letters tell a different story. The scribe writes that the blood of the princess cries in the fountain still, and there is no mercy but in fear. They swear by every god that no head of that house will ever lift itself above our walls again. The scribe's brother replies that men on the Boneway speak of travelers seized at night, a woman of pale hair hidden under a cap, a boy wrapped in a tinker's cloak. The one account justifies, the other seethes. Between them one can hear the echo of a truth neither says. Whether styled mercy or security, the effect was the same. Flight compelled, return perilous. When I say compelled, I do not mean that the law forced all who could claim the blood to take ship. Not all did. A bastard who did not carry the name could survive. And some did, tucked into holdfasts that had once sent tithes to the Dragon Kings. A girl married quickly to a man beyond suspicion might also remain, kissed into anonymity. But those who had worn the name or had a strong claim to wearing it felt the walls closing, and those who offered them shelter felt walls closing around them too. One letter from House Derry pleads for grain and laments the crown's suspicion. The Derrys were known for their old loyalty to the dragons, and they suffered for it in tithes, in inspections of their ledgers, and in the smugness of neighbors. There is a tendency among later writers to call this vindictiveness. It is perhaps better called an attempt to erase symbols without seeming to erase faces. If there was an unwritten law of the first year, it was that men were not to say aloud what their actions made very clear. The word edict appears on several pages, but most often next to lands and titles, not people. Legal scholars in the faith service have pointed out that the realm inherited two chests of law from the conquest, one chest of royal decrees and one chest of undull custom. When the two chests disagreed, Targaryen kings had often taken a coin from the first chest and purchased the second. The new king, having come to the throne by a sequence uncommon in written law but not without precedent in the cycles of power, could not afford to throw the second chest into the bay. Thus we see great care that forms are observed even as new forms are made. The attainder of houses that had risen against the crown in the last civil war had been enacted by proclamation and then regularized by grants and charters. The new regime followed suit, with an added flavor of erasing certain styles and seals with clean strokes. A decree that forbids the use of a seal bearing three-headed fire is a tidy thing. One that forbids the return of a family alive and mourning invites correspondence from every sept in the realm. The crown preferred tidy things, but it hired men who knew how to give them sharp edges. The sharp edges appear in warrants, and the warrants happen in certain places rather than everywhere. Gulltown, White Harbor, King's Landing, and the Arbor receive the most, as does Driftmark. In the Harbor Book of Driftmark that survived the fire of the 26th year of the reign, there is a column marked Royal Instructions and a series of entries that read Inspect ships from Pentos, hold suspected, send to city on site. The writs are signed by the master of ships and sometimes by the hand. The phrase on site is notable. It applies no longer to symbols but to faces. How did they know, you ask, which faces? A good question, and one that takes us into the humbler literature of the moment. Broadsheets and whispers. A broadsheet printed in the city in crude type and spread on the docks shows a woodcut of a boy whose hair has been inked lighter than the rest, with the caption, "Wanted for the King's Peace." The boy is every pale-haired boy and none in particular. Verus informants, if one believes the memory of a Goldcloak's captain told long after over wine, had a different list of more precise names and places. The captain says the eunuch could smell dragon's blood through cloth and lies. I will not pretend to know how that was done. I note that the captain was drunk and the tale was meant to frighten a younger man into swallowing his pride. I have mentioned incests and sermons, and some will wonder why I bring them into a matter of exile. Because doctrine is a lever that can move stones the hand alone cannot budge. The faith had opposed Targaryen marriages of kin for generations and had been at times cowed, at times complicit, at times converted to other labors. In the years after the fall, there came a flood of homilies rehearsing the old arguments, but with a new twist. So long as the sinful union persisted, the realm could expect no peace. This is not a legal argument. It is a public one, and a potent one. When a man hears that the drought took the river because a man's uncle married his niece, the world looks a certain way. I do not laugh at this. Men need causes. They are not content with wins. One homily, put together by the meanest of the city's septs and attributed to the so-called Sparrow School, set forth the syllogism that if incest defile, the defiled must be cleansed, and if the cleansing must be by absence rather than by ash, then their absence becomes the realm's justice. Note the clever pivot. Makeshift banishment becomes not a temporary measure of security but a lasting condition of righteousness. And once righteousness is on your side, you can stop writing warrants and let sermons do the work that charters cannot do without shame. It is time to attempt a timeline, knowing as I do that any such attempt will be contentious. I will lay down dates by moons, following the calendar of the High Septon's office for those years as copied. At the starry September, in the third moon of the last year of the war, the prince fell at the river, and in the fourth moon the city opened its gates to new arms. In the fifth moon, letters went out from the Red Keep under the signatures of the Hand and the Master of Laws, calling on the ports to watch for certain persons connected with the late king. In the sixth moon, a circle of allies of the new regime convened informally at the Eyrie. I infer this meeting from a cluster of letters with similar language sent to lords in the Vale and Riverlands. In the first moon of the new year, the proclamation on the King's Peace was read at Old Town. The chronicle of the Red Keep notes great rejoicing, and a letter from White Harbor describes sailors hearing the stag's words. In the second moon, warrants to Driftmark and the city begin to speak of on site. In the third, the writ of Summerhall, as we call it, was drafted, but like all summer plans it rained, by which I mean its provisions concerning some castles were delayed for lack of garrisons. In the fourth moon, a Bravosi notary logged the visit of envoys asking for the detention of certain named fugitives. In the fifth moon, the High Septon's sermon concerning the cleansing of blood was copied and spread, and the broadsheet with the pale-haired boy was set by the presses of a Lannisport printer and carried by peddlers as far as the Trident. By the end of that year, letters of men who had once sworn to the dragon begin to show a new phrase: "We keep the king's peace." The singing had taken root. What is uncertain, sorely uncertain, is whether any act of that year or the next said in words that cannot be parsed away, "No member of House Targaryen may set foot in our lands." If such a line was written, it has burned, or it was written in a chamber where men did not keep copies, or it never left the mouth and thus left no bruise upon parchment. The nearest is a letter to Lord Manderley requiring that he not suffer the return of any who claim the dragon's style and blood, and as a matter of practice that amounts to the same thing. Here I come to the other uncertainty that shrouds our work like morning fog. What precisely counts as the house? The faith's chroniclers at the time speak of the house as if it were a standard with 3 heads, a thing raised or lowered but never altered. Legal minds of the Vale, writing in the 3rd year after the war, speak of the house as a surname, capable of being set aside by marriage or the lack of a father's pride. Merchants of the narrow sea speak of it as a face and a hair, the sort of thing one could dye or cover. A devout hedge knight wrote of the house as a stain, which is to admit a fear that does not confess itself in law books, and may be the truest of those 4 descriptions if one seeks to know not what the law was said to be but how men acted. And what of the free cities? Much later letters make much sport of their hypocrisy, but at the time their hypocrisy was our opportunity as much as our embarrassment. Pentos, whose magisters are said to be shaped like their coin chests, promised to send away any trouble born of your troubles, while quietly selling bread and roofs to those who came with empty purses and pale hair. Bravos gave shelter as is their custom, but they also let it be known that no Sellsword company under their law would take a contract to bring back a royal head. Lys, with its peculiar blend of pleasure and piety, wrote polite letters about curbing of sins and took in a golden tide. None of this amounts to banishment in the strict sense. It does amount to the provisioning of exile, which is a more accurate description of what transpired. We did not banish so much as arrange a world in which the banished could exist without risking our sleep, provided they kept to their side of the sea. I have lingered long upon documents and letters, and there are readers who will wish for the salt of personal testimony. We have some, and I will give it. A serving man who later became a caravan guard wrote that he saw a small party embark on a rain-slick quay, the woman pale and calm, the boy sullen and cold. He does not name them. He does not need to. A guardsman of the Red Keep, later pensioned by a lord who learned to admire him for his steadiness rather than his wit, told his children that on a certain night the master of whisperers ordered a gate opened and that he was commanded not to look. The children grew into adults who argued over what he had meant by not looking. The grandchildren wrote to a septon, who wrote to me, and I wrote back that the most important feature of such tales is the command not to look. It means not only that secrecy was valued, but that secrecy was shared, in small and common ways, by men of common standing. If banishment had been a matter of trumpet and drum, why hide the gate in the dark? The answer is in the old soldier's pride. He wanted to have taken part in something lawful. They gave him a thing done in shadows and expected him to call it light. You will ask whether the absence of a single clear decree matters. After all, if a man is hunted from his home by warrants and sermons, by neighbors eager to curry favor with sheriffs, by the closing of keys and the souring of purses, has he not been banished? The lived experience of the hunted is not less real for want of a clerk's flourish. I agree, yet it matters for how we understand the polity that endured. Banishment in law creates a category that lasts until revoked. A practice born of fear creates a habit that can be made and unmade as circumstances change. One can see the difference most clearly in the later years of the new reign when men, no longer fearing uprisings in every copse of the crownlands, grew careless about whispers in taverns. A man in King's Landing speaks of a girl beyond the sea. The goldcloaks do not break his teeth. A merchant writes a letter to a partner in Tyrosh mentioning a woman and a boy. The letter is not confiscated. Practices loosen. Edicts would have held like old bone. We must be careful, then, in our choice of words. To call what happened banishment is to pretend to a certainty and a permanence that did not exist, and in that pretending we flatter the crown beyond its due and we strip from the exiles a measure of agency they did, in fact, retain. This does not absolve the crown of ruthlessness. When a Sellsword brought to the master of whisperers a lock of pale hair and a pair of rings, he was paid and told he might spend his purse in the street of silk. When a Bravosi captain took payment for information about a ship that bore certain passengers, he was told to dock at dusk and take water quietly. Such stories come down to us by ways I cannot wholly verify, and I admit as much. I do not include those that strain credulity for the sake of the young, who delight in wicked cleverness. But in the hustle of markets and harbors, there is continuity enough of quiet deeds to suggest a policy. It was never written plainly, this policy, and perhaps this is the heart of it: to do in private what could not, for the sake of fragile legitimacy, be declared in public as a permanent law. A crown that has won a throne with the sword does not relish telling a realm that it cannot forgive a family's mere existence. Better to say the family has no right and the realm compels no one, while ensuring by 100 evils that life here would be a narrower prison than any island. I will put forward a reconciliation of the sources that may satisfy none and yet secures the largest portion of the truth. The first year brought proclamations designed to end one kind of war and prevent another. The second brought land grants and offices rearranged to absorb the shock of a new line. The third brought a thinning of the energies of vengeance and a greater concern with harvests, pirates, and the northern roads. What had been urgent became routine. What had been a hunt became a rumor. In that passage, the shape of what people later called banishment congealed. Men like stories that resolve. A finality after chaos is tonic. The idea that the realm had lifted its hand and erased a house satisfied something in those who had watched the old banners burn. The exiles, for their part, had to tell a different story. Not that they had been erased, but that they had chosen the honorable path. Not that they were ghosts clinging to stones, but that they were princes in waiting, forced by base treachery to bide their time. In letters preserved by a Pentoshi magister, these letters I have read only in copy, sent to me by a colleague with the stamp of Pentos. The boy who would grow into bitterness writes of our return, as if it were a certainty planted by the gods. The man who sheltered him writes of your safety, as if it were a commodity. Both knew, perhaps even then, that safety in exile and banishment in memory were partners in a dance. The chroniclers quarrel on matters of detail because details are their pride. Did the High Septon name the old house sinners but not traitors? Did the hand's letter to Gulltown use the euphemism seed of contraries? Or did the clerk invent it? Was the writ of Summerhall truly drafted at Summerhall? Or was that name a romantic addition of a later scribe seeking a balance of fire and ash? I confess my ignorance where ignorance is best and have in each case told you what I know. The larger tension among our sources is not about dates but about the nature of the act. Court chroniclers incline to mercy, and speak as if the new king in wisdom chose not to bloody his hands further and so offered the old house the grace of exile. Letters from Dorne incline to rage, and speak as if the new king feared to finish what he began and so pawned his cruelty upon small men and harbors. The truth is both more ordinary and more patient. There was cruelty, there was calculation. There was fear of stirring pity with too much gore. There was also the cold arithmetic of risk. So long as a claimant lived abroad, he might gather a sword or a ship. A realm tired of war judged that it could endure that risk if it did not have to endure the sight of that claimant in a sept or at a lord's feast. There is an unpleasant feature of our talk that should be drawn out rather than left as subtext. The difference between banishment and eradication. If the latter had been chosen as goal and doctrine, the record would look different. We would have no need for rummaging in ledgers and letters, for the story would have no second act. Many more copies of a certain work would not exist. But from the first, there were men around the king who recoiled from atrocity done in sunlight. The memory of the sack weighed on more consciences than singers permit. If one reads the northern letters in that first year, sparse, clipped, not prone to flights of language, one hears a tone that says, "We have one enough." Those men did not want to poison their victory with slaughters that would blush the children of their children. To say that aloud would have been to wound the pride of those who felt the realm had suffered too much to leave embers piled. So they did not say it aloud. They allowed policies that packed embers into boxes of wet sand and shipped them away, and they told the realm the fire had been won out of the logs. I have spoken of uncertainties that remain. Let me gather them. We do not possess, in any archive I have surveyed, a single sealed, comprehensive writ declaring in so many words the perpetual exile of House Targaryen and the penalties for return. The closest texts are piecemeal, aimed at ports and titles rather than persons, and couched in language that performs mercy while arranging difficulty. We do not know with certainty whether the High Septon's declarations drew a clean line between sin and outlawry or whether later copyists softened his language to spare the dignity of that office. We cannot say whether the writ of Summerhall's missing leaves named other castles and offices in the same manner it names Dragonstone, and if it did, whether any language concerning heir's presence in the realm was included. We are not certain when the policy of bounties on bearers of that style and blood began and when it ended, for the port books show entries that slacken and then pick up again in years when rumors blew in from the east. And we do not know, for the exiles had the sense to burn their rubbish as carefully as our lords. The texture of their days and the measure of what we call a policy did to their minds. One might ask, then, whether the term banishment should be cast aside. I would not press so far. It is the word the people use, and words the people use grow into their own truth. A cart that arrives after a long day's march may be called salvation even if it had only 3 wheels. The man who rode it does not pull a measuring rod from his belt. If the practical effect on the old house was to make a return beyond the narrow sea a peril to life and an invitation to war, the practical effect is what the realm remembers and names. But a historian must know the shape of the ground over which the wheels bumped. We do not honor truth by pretending that the realm solved its problem by law. We do not honor truth by missing the degree to which conscience, fear, appetite, and piety together arranged a new equilibrium in which the old house could continue, because we wanted to be the kind of people who could say we had allowed them to continue, while simultaneously we wanted to be the kind of people who had ensured they would not trouble our tables. The measured conclusion, then, is this. There was no single banishment, but a season of acts which, collectively and with deliberate ambiguity, made residence impossible and return lethal. Those acts grew out of the immediate needs of a victorious alliance to secure itself, the desire of a realm scalded by war to find a story of mercy, the scruples of the faith against certain marriages that provided convenient language for a moral distinction, and the time-honored practice of lords to turn faces into titles and titles into lands and lands into loyal men. The legal pretexts favored property and symbols over flesh. This was wisdom masquerading as squeamishness. The political chorus was tuned to a single mode. No dragon standard here. The tensions among our chronicles come from where they were written and for whom. The Red Keep speaks to itself about contributing to peace. Sunspear and Duskendale speak of stains to be washed and debts unpaid. The reconciled timeline shows us energy at the beginning, the setting of bones after, and then, as seasons turn, a forgetting that is not merciful so much as convenient. If this disappoints those who like Bell and Torch, I am content to disappoint. To say that a house was banished is to summarize more than to assert. It is, oddly, a courtesy we extend to the past, so we need not look too closely at the ways we fail to write our cruelties in clean ink. If it consoles those who feel the world ought to be settled by words sealed in wax, I cannot help you there. The world is more often settled by practice, and practice writes in water. What remains, truer than either of those consolations, is that men whose hair marks them for a name found that the sea was not a moat but a schooling. They learned other tongues, they learned patience, they learned the taste of longing. Meanwhile, men whose seals could fill ledgers with tidy columns learned how to let their ledgers be the law. That is what the banishment of House Targaryen amounts to in sober analysis. A mutual education in absence, one side studying how to be present far away, the other how to be absent at home. And all the while the realm rehearsed a tune it liked the sound of, a tune that says a door closed, never mind that we never built the hinge. There is a final doubt I have not voiced because it belongs at the end. It concerns how we read the future back into the past. Once one has seen a pale-haired woman standing on a high place, once one has heard the thrum of a rumor spread across leagues faster than a raven can fly, one is tempted to imagine that the men of that first year foresaw what we know. They did not. They were clumsy as we are. They did what they could with letters and seals, with homemade sermons and the clatter of hooves on the cobbles at dusk. That is why they did not write the banishment as law. Law is for things men understand. Practice is for things they fear. If our descendants someday speak of the recall of House Targaryen or of their extinction or of their continuing in some thin, stubborn way, they will write with the same clumsy hands and call it a bell again. Let them. We, today, may be content to say that the realm, having wearied of a line that had come to embody its quarrel with itself, pushed that quarrel across the sea, and once it was out of sight, named the quarrel solved. That is closer to the truth than any ink I will ever see, and it is an ending, if not a neat one, that history can stomach without choking. There is a temptation, before leaving the matter to dust, to consider each of the 7 kingdoms in turn, for realms are not an undifferentiated field, and a thing done in King's Landing does not always look the same from Carhold or Sunspear. If we are cautious, this survey may be more than a litany. It may supply those minor ridges and hollows by which a traveler keeps his bearings when mists rise. Begin with the Crownlands, where the writs were conceived and where blunt practice most nearly resembled theory. There the City Watch learned, in the first spring after the war, to read faces for hair and eyes and scars rather than the stains of petty crime. There the master of ships' scribes cut their quills on lists of names that shifted with rumor. There the faith's preachers found an eager audience for the ocean that the realm had been chastened for a bloodline's presumptions. Banishment as practice needed no translation in streets where men knew which alleys opened onto the river and which did not. A dockside rule emerged. Ask fewer questions, keep your purse in front of you, let a man with a hood pass. It is from here, too, that orders fanned out to ports and castles with the confidence of those who have just learned how to give orders without hanging for them. To the Stormlands fell the part of stern elder brother. Their lord had struck the hardest blows in the final months, and their banners had stood longest without faltering. Many a letter from Griffin's Roost or Tarth adopts a tone of having been right early, which is one of the kingdom's minor vices. Here the prohibition on harboring bearers of that style and blood was read with an old sailor's literalism. If the crown said keep them out, then keep them out, reduce the matter to weather and rope. A coastal reeve's ledger I examined in Evenfall Bay shows fines levied not for the sheltering of exiles. No names appear, and names are dangerous things, but for unguarded night landings, which is the Stormlanders' way of punishing the effect without naming the cause. The Hands men liked the Stormlands for their obedience. The Faith liked them for their hymns. The Stormlands liked themselves for both. The North, by contrast, has always had a knack for obeying the letter while ignoring the music. From Winterfell went back the tittiest replies, acknowledging receipt of proclamations concerning peace, acknowledging, too, in clipped and heartening phrases, that the dragon standard would never again be flown in the king's realm. What the North did not do was turn itself into a search party. I do not say that fugitives could have walked the King's Road in silver helms, but a girl with a hood and a boy with luck might pass into a land where the distance between holdfasts is measured in hearths rather than in decrees. One captain of White Cloaks, writing years later, complained that north of the neck, a raven with a broken wing can hide for a year. This, I think, is truer of policies than of birds. The custom that binds the North is the custom of keeping winter at bay, and it has little patience for extra laws born in the heat of southern victories. If any of the Pale Line ever knocked on a northern door and asked for bread, I suspect the door found a reason to be opened and the bread found a reason to be stale enough to be forgettable. This is inference, not proof. It is the kind of inference a northerner would not bother to deny. The Riverlands were raw. The trident still murmured to men in their sleep. The Targaryens had never been theirs by blood, but they had been theirs by weighty habit, and many small lords who had tied their fortunes to older arrangements now found themselves reciting new prayers. It is here that the phrase seed of contraries appears most often in copies, and I take that as a sign less of delicacy than of uncertainty, a way of naming trouble without naming neighbors. Riverlords are rivermen even on horseback. They prefer currents that pull and strands that hold fast. A writ that told them to forbid a family's very return must have struck them as a ripping away. Better to forbid a style, a sigil, a seal. In the ledger of a sept near Stony September there is a purchase of wax impressed with 3 stags and a long note in the margin on whether the old stores of red wax ought to be melted and poured into new tins, for fear of improper impressions. The monastic concern for seals is not trivial. It is how men whose hands are clean measure the unseen reach of policy. A seal changed means a world changed, and in that change lies the substitute for laws that counselors dared not write. Westerland's practice is the most polished and, for that reason, the hardest to read. There are very few angry letters from Lannisport, and Casterly Rock is far from the path any exile would choose. Yet one senses in the soft, clean lines of their correspondence a pride in doing things beyond reproach. If the king's peace forbade the lifting again of the 3-headed standard, then no tapestry in a public hall would sport that embroidery. If the king's ships wanted to take water and tin in Lannisport and did not want to be asked why, then account books would list general crown expense without pushing quills into sore flesh. It is from the West, too, that the most articulate arguments against a formal legal banishment appear in the records, not for love of the old house, but because great lords who have once seen lands and offices rearranged do not relish permitting a doctrine that might, in some future inversion of fortune, be turned upon their own names. One such argument, penned by a counselor whose signature was replaced in a later copy with a bland flourish, runs thus: if residence can be extinguished by decree without trial and without a crime named, what then keeps a man from being made into a class of outlaw by mere rumor? Say what you will of that line, it is the work of a mind trained to the balancing of scales, and I think it did its small work in keeping the worst words off the largest parchments. The Reach, ever attentive to harvests and hymns, multiplied the moral pretexts and reduced them to habit. No public banishment, no. Better to make pilgrimage songs about bread growing thin in sinful years and about fountains running clearer when blood is not mixed with blood. Carters sing what they are given and repeat what pays. A messenger from Old Town to High Garden in that first year might hear the same refrain 4 times and never notice the small alterations in its middle lines, where some clever septon had learned to wedge in a caution against talking too much about cousins who had gone across the sea. From the oaken seat comes a household manual with a section on how to store winter apples. The same hand writes later in a new section on household vigilance, with advice on strangers whose speech runs too smooth and boys whose hair catches too much light, the whole put in the style of stewardly counsel rather than the language of law. We learn here how easily piety and economy absorb policy. Do the prudent thing. The prudent thing advances the crown. Call it prudence and not service. The veil is ever the veil, careful and high. It snows making men think in quiet geometries. The letters from the airy surrounding the informal meeting I have inferred from their shared turns of phrase display an almost mathematical courtesy. These are men who mean to support the new order and who mean also to protect the forms that make their own power credible. It is from here, in a memorandum attributed to Maester Jodhar of Longbow Hall, that we get our cleanest statement of the legal dilemma. Banishment is a sentence passed upon a person after a formal naming of offense and a formal offering of alternatives. If there is neither offense named nor alternative offered, what we call their removal is in truth only a custom, and customs change. The memorandum then argues, persuasively to my ear, that custom is nonetheless useful if managed modestly. It furnishes a way for men to act without binding the realm to a principle it might later repent. That is the veil in a phrase. Do not burn bridges, tend them in fog. Dorn does not forgive, but it does not forget that vengeance has a price. The letters that bleed from Sunspear in those early months are covered, like the lemon trees in the first hard wind, and the covering betrays the shape beneath. A scribe writes of fountains, another of courtyards with shadows more stubborn than the afternoon heat, another of armor hung without polish. The old house whose fall everyone else turned into moral example here became family matter and debt. It is in such letters that one first sees the idea that exile might be an insult too mild and a cruelty too sly, that a realm which calls itself merciful while turning its eyes away in the alleys performs a kind of blasphemy worse than condemnations. But Dorn has learned to make long games out of short wrongs. They did not cut the harp strings. They tuned them down to a different key. The archers of the Bone Way do not need proclamations to act. They need only a sense of where a favor might be owed 10 years hence. If an exile passed through their scrub and stones, the wind would be the wiser, and no parchment would know. The Iron Islands paid the least attention, because the sea taught them older lessons and because their rebellion later put different flavors of outlawry in their mouths. The Ironborn ledgers I have seen that date to this interlude are filled with fish, rope, salt, oars, and the occasional hammer. Here the king's peace is something that happens to other men's courts, and the flying of a dragon's standard matters only insofar as it changes who owns the dock where you sell plundered wool. Yet even here the story reached. A priest's sermon in Lordsport on the false fires of men who wed their own contains a careful coda reminding boys that pale hair in a harbor might bring gold if carried to the right ship. If that is not a crown's policy in coarse dress, I do not know what is. Thus the survey. Its point is not to decorate a map, but to show how a single policy without a single word could wear 7 shapes and still be itself. If there were one great decree, sealed 3 times in black wax and read from 10 stone pulpits, it could not have matched the reach accomplished by 100 local kinds of obedience and disobedience. The argument for a bell becomes weaker, not stronger, the more attentively we look. These regional variations make more sense if we place them upon the older foundations of law and custom I sketched in passing earlier. Undull custom, first men tradition, and the cobbled-together royal edicts of 3 centuries take different views of abjuration. Septon Leopold, in a tract that nobody reads except those forced to prove they have read it, defines abjuration as the formal forswearing of peace with a man who forswears the king. That formulation presumes that the man has first forsworn, publicly and undeniably. Exile, in Leopold's system, is either self-chosen because a man refuses to come to law, or after a verdict of outlawry. Neither chain fits the facts we hold. No formal summons was sent to a Targaryen claimant to appear at any court that could bind him. No jury sat. The very notion of a jury in this context is absurd, though it is a useful absurdity that demonstrates how far our terms are being stretched when we call what followed banishment. Maester Kalahar, whose tracts on royal abjurations I mentioned before, tried to mend the gap by arguing that the offense named need not be a specific act. It may be the condition of being the wrong sovereign. This is legal poetry, and like most poetry, it persuades less when you stand up and measure it. If being the wrong sovereign is a crime, then every war of succession resolves itself into a court case. If every war is a case, then every winner has won by the law and never by the sword. There are lords in the West who would smile at such comfort. There are small folk buried under hedges who would not. Some readers will think my reluctance to sanctify the word banishment a mere exercise in exactness. And sometimes exactness is only a virtue men take on when they cannot have courage. But here exactness preserves something larger than tidiness. It preserves an angle of moral sight. Say the realm exiled the old house, and the realm appears as a person on a dais bestowing a punishment. Say the realm rearranged its ledgers, lowered its flags, and hired quiet hands, and the realm appears for what it was. A gathering of men trying not to learn too much about the acts they paid for. When, years later, another king, older, fatter, bored by peace, sent a blunt demand that the girl and her whelp be cut off in a far city, his small council argued law while the quills of factors and sellsword captains were already making their sums. That later episode does not belong to my present inquiry, and yet it throws into relief the habit established in the beginning, that public law would trail behind private practice until practice forced law to notice. Documents are our bones, but bones lie. We must pick them up and see where they have been scraped. The fragments of the writ of Summerhall, about which I have already made more of a romance than I should, if romance is measured by the number of times a man uses the word allegedly, deserve more careful handling. 3 fragments, 3 hands, 3 different qualities of parchment. One shows salt browning at the edges, as if it lived a season near the sea. One bears a puncture that does not amount to a rip, as if a nail held it where it did not belong. One is too white, which means it is too clean, which means it might be a later copy pretending to be earlier. The style of the titles. By the grace of gods and swords alike, King of the Undulls, the Roiner, and the First Men, tells us the moment. New men trying on old phrases to see which fit. It is what is missing that teaches. A writ that conveys Dragonstone without naming a person but only an office, and that conveys offices without naming living holders, is a writ written by men eager to leave out anyone who has a brother who might protest. That is why I trust the core of the fragment, even if the edges have been smoothed by hands who wanted smoother stories. Scribes matter, too, in ways only scribes admit. I have handled the copybooks of the Eyrie and of Casterly Rock, the narrow, aching hands of Old Town, the broad, cheerful lines of Winterfell. There is a hand that slants upward in the red keep in that first year, as if the man behind it were excited and in a hurry. He later learned to write level. There is a hand in Gulltown that thickens when it must write bearers of that style and blood, as if the man were pressing harder to make himself believe the euphemism. There is a hand in White Harbor that leaves too much space between lines, the habit of a careful man expecting emendations he knows will come. All these hands are the noisy, dusty machinery by which policy becomes permanence, and from them we learn that no bell tolled. Scribes do not forget bells. They draw them in the margins. A word about that broadsheet some have doubted, with justice. The city has never possessed true presses, and if a Lannisport engraver keeps a crude screw to pull ink out of a board, it does not follow that the 7 kingdoms have the art of printing. My reference to a woodcut circulated on the quay, as if it were a sheet run by rollers, was an indulgence I permitted myself to move quickly where more care was due. There was a woodcut, I remain convinced, carried by hand from stall to stall. taken in coin across the bay by a Tyroshi peddler who had found that pictures of pale-haired boys drew gossip, which drew business. The image, greasy with touch, would have stood in for a law few men could read. Think of it, if you like, as a painted sign for a policy not yet willing to be letters. A boy who saw it might remember being told to turn his face away from soldiers. A soldier who saw it might remember being told not to look too long at a certain kind of hair. Such are the schools where policy learns to walk. We have not yet plumbed the role of the citadel, and that is a fault I gladly repair. Archmasters rarely stoop to the events of their own generation. They prefer the safety of long-ago errors. Yet even the most abstract ring must pass for polishing through a practical hand. And in those first years, the citadel polished more than was later recalled. The register of chains forged in Old Town shows an unusual number of ravens ordered for the Crownlands and the ports of Driftmark and White Harbor. A cynical mind will say that ravens always fly more when secrets are large. A charitable mind will say the citadel loves order and serves whatever lord seems likeliest to restore it. In the marginalia of one archmaester known for his distaste for kings, I found a note that the crown proposes to do privately what the faith will not bless publicly. Gentlemen may prefer their secrets if they will keep their hands off our ledgers. The citadel's neutrality is not as cold as we peddle it to our acolytes. We blessed the peace and we corrected its grammar. We did not draft a banishment because we understood, better than we admit, that a careful silence is sometimes kinder to a frayed realm than precise cruelty. The free cities, to which I promised earlier I would return, deserve a more granular sketch. Pentos smiled and sold bread to anyone who could pay. This disposition, which Pentoshi called prudence and everyone else calls greed, was a blessing to exiles whose coin ran thin and a curse to king's men hoping for easy captures. Volantis took the opportunity to quarrel with itself, as Volantis always does. Its old blood took the side of remembering debts owed to dragon lords dead 2 centuries, and its new blood took the side of counting each visit from a crown's agent as a negotiation useful for later coal tariffs. Bravos practiced its customary courtesy, which is the refined art of saying no with presence and, when pressed, of selling the same information twice. Tyrosh calculated whether the settlement of a pale-haired family might bring skilled hands or ill luck and decided, in the manner of Tyrosh, that everything is alloyed. Take a little of both and polish the result. Lys cloaked its matters in silk, and if rumor is true that a certain household was sheltered in a quarter where the windows are very small and the courtyards very green, rumor is at least old and consistent. Mir kept its devotions to craft. If a man could cut glass or mend a lens, he might be forgiven his name. Norvos and Kohor had their own ODs and their own prides and prefer to despise our quarrels from the safe height of conceit. Lorith would have given shelter to a dragon if one had learned to fish, and Ibn, if reached at all, would have given it with a grunt. All of this reads like travel writing, but it is in fact the outline of a narrow canal through which a family could flow when a river was dammed at home. Money is the water of that canal. The Iron Bank keeps the records it keeps, but men are men, and soft memos sometimes leak. A factor's letter to a clerk mentions securing collateral in the form of a lease on a warehouse near a Bervosi bridge for the protection of persons of interest to several parties. I do not overread the line. I merely point to the fact that neutral languages exist precisely to house dangerous arrangements. When later kings considered whether to pay sellswords to end the exile's tale, they discovered that a culture had formed in which men at desks preferred the story of endless interest to the story of ending a life. Wars have conclusions because men run out of food. Exiles go on because bankers prefer to let their candles burn to stubs. We should consider also the shadow of older pretenders that fell across all these judgments. The very memory of the Blackfire troubles gave the new regime a ready-made caution baked into its porridge. A realm that has seen one bastard line take coin, ships, and songs to sea does not easily permit another pale head to lodge at an inn near the quay. Men who had fathers that died for or against a black dragon took their sons to the steps of Seps and said with rough voices that banners carry more blood than cloth. This was less law than inoculation. A steady fever in memory makes future infections less likely, and when a new boy across the sea began to be called a prince by men eager for a cause, the fever stirred. I begin to suspect that what we call the banishment of House Targaryen was as much an act of collective memory. Remembering what goes wrong when pretenders have harbors, as it was an act of collective will drafted in any chamber. Individual lives give the lie to the grandest of theses. A boy is told to change his name. A woman is told to bind her hair and to answer to a title that is not quite a lie but is in agreement with fear. A knight without a household pawned his sword to buy passage for 3 strangers, half because he believed, half because he wanted to believe he belonged to the sort of tale in which such men find their honor again. A ship's captain remembers being paid in a coin with the king's face and in a coin whose face meant nothing to him. A factor in Bravos remembers locking a back gate and telling his daughter not to look out the window at night. None of these men could have described their lives as the carrying out of a banishment. They would have said they were protecting their bargains or their children or their souls. Yet if one mirrors these small acts against our ledgers and proclamations, one sees their echoes enlarge into policy. The larger shape is always a crowd of little shapes holding hands. I have avoided for as long as I could the thorn that everything in this inquiry snags on, the memory of a house with a red door and a lemon tree. I do not name the child who remembers it, for I am faithful to my own rule about not leaning on memory when memory is hungry. Yet dozens of our notes are annotated by younger hands with a miniature lemon in the margin, as if that one image could be proof that the exile's life was peaceful or that the crown's policy was merciful. The truth is less simple. The red door may have been one of many doors painted thus in a district where red paint was cheap and preferred. Lemon trees can be carried in pots even in cities where the wind is wrong and the market is crowded. A household can make a day seem safe without being safe. If anything, the image is proof of the success of an ambiguous policy. It gave the exiles enough to form tender recollections and gave the crown enough to say later that it had not hunted children through alleys. We learn from it that men prefer pictures to clauses, and that a picture hung in memory will outlast any seal on any writ. That is a lesson for us who stoop over ink. One more detour into the language of the thing before we shape our end. Deposed dragon, seed of contraries, bearers of that style and blood, persons of interest. Each of these phrases avoids the naked form of a family's name. Why? A half-dozen reasons. Names conjure pity. Names sound like invitations. Names solidify enemies into the sort of idols that draw zealots. But the chief reason is legal. To name a family in a document that carries penalties is to name a class whose identity does not depend on conduct. Undull custom is impatient with such classes. We have our villains, but we prefer them one by one. There are exceptions, wolves burned out when they take a taste for sheep, bands of robbers named and hunted, but even these are tied to acts, not to blood. The reluctance to write the house's name alongside a penalty is therefore not mere squeamishness. It is the crooked continuation of an older straightness, one that arguably saved the realm from worse abuses later. If we must sometimes praise men for their clumsy virtues, this is the place. They forgot to write the hard word, and so they left open the door to occasions when mercy could visit unannounced. I said earlier that practice writes in water. It also writes in coin. Bounties rise and bounties fall with the health of the treasury, and if you watch the curve of those numbers across the first 5 years, as I have in a composite ledger assembled with more patience than pride, you see that the price set on the capture of any person claiming the dragon style and blood spikes when river piracy spikes and when border skirmishes require quiet punishments. The crown learned to use the exiles the way an innkeeper uses salt herring. To sell something else. We will pay 30 dragons, a paper might whisper to a certain kind of man. And while we do, we will not pay the full price of your wheat. That is an ugly way to reduce men to arithmetic, and the world is an ugly place when wheat is scarce. We who prefer our stories to be about symbols and decrees must occasionally stand still and acknowledge the vulgarity that kept the determination alive long after the first fever of victory cooled. Exiles are useful because they are a kind of coin. A thornier branch presents itself when we ask what became of those of the house who were not the house, the cousins of cousins, the caretakers of cousins, the men and women who might, in a season of forgetfulness, pass unremarked and marry and die on some alien shore. The chronicles leave them in a fog because the chronicles prefer strong lines. Letters from Essos, petulant and practical by turns. Reconsider these gossamer lives more honestly. There are hints of a baker in Pentos whose mother remembered Dragonstone and who whispered to her grandchildren that flour has its own fire if you handle it rightly. There is a hint of a household in Tyrosh whose men shaved their beards in a northern style for 2 generations because an old woman once said she had loved a man whose father had been loved by a queen. These are ghosts of ghosts. Yet the crown's habit of phrasing its demands around bearers of that style and blood created a worry in free cities that blood could be contagious by rumor, and sometimes rumor is more dangerous than blood. So caution thickened and anonymity grew. If we count these misted lives within the tally of Banishment's effect, we count honestly, though our fingers pass through air. All this leaves us uncomfortably close to the line beyond which a historian ought not step, the line that separates the careful collation of documents from the theater of speculation. Yet some speculations are simply the formal naming of what the documents already suggest. What if, for example, a formal Great Council had been summoned, not to choose a king but to determine the status of the old royal house? The Reach would have come with sermons, the West with arguments about class and trial, the North with a long memory and a reluctance to name a perpetual outlawry, the Stormlands with a stomach for titles newly arranged and seas newly patrolled, the Vale with careful words about custom and practice, the Riverlands with hymns to the king's peace, Dorne with unsheathed names and scars lifted to the light. A great council held under such winds would have produced a statement layered over with cautious pomp, no doubt, but it could not have improved upon the actual effect. It could, however, have done one harm. By naming the house, it would have fixed it in law, and to fix it in law is to preserve it in amber. The realm had more sense than to give the exiles the dignity of that amber. We should ask, too, what the practice did to the men who ordered it. That the exiles learned to be present far away is clear enough. That those who stayed learned to be absent at home is the sort of phrase a reader may nod at and set aside as elegant without taste. Let us be specific. The king learned to accept reports purporting to settle matters that had not been settled, and in so learning he became content with the kind of man who brings him reports. The hand learned to prefer a letter that says, "Conclude as may be best," over a letter that says, "I concluded." And in this preference his office grew cautious in ways that later cost the realm dearly. The master of whisperers learned to spend coin in the dark and later learned that such coin is its own hunger. The Grand Maester learned to unlearn titles in his sleep. The Septon learned to thread moral pleas into the weft of market days. Men who practice these habits for a season cannot always set them aside when the season ends. When later crises came, as later crises always do, the council's muscle remembered the old exercise. That is not nothing. It may be the most practical legacy of the so-called banishment. A class of men who learned to avoid choosing by teaching themselves to like the taste of not having chosen. I have spoken long and perhaps asked patience beyond the measure even of those who love parchments. But I owe the record one last assemblage of what we can say with fair confidence and what we must leave open. There was no single decree that matches the people's memory of a banishment. There was an array of edicts and letters, most concerning property and symbols, some concerning ports and faces, and all concerned above all else with the king's peace and with not naming a thing that would be inconvenient to name later. There were sermons that translated policy into fable. There were bounties that translated fable back into coin. There were free cities that translated coin into rooms with red doors and small courtyards. There were regions of the realm that translated central vagueness into local certainty or, just as meaningfully, into local indifference. There were scribes who concealed their consciences in the thickness of a downstroke and their fears in the space between lines. There were letters from men who hated the old house for reasons that were reasons and letters from men who loved the old house for reasons that were songs. And there was a people who slept better when they could sing a bell into the past than when they had to admit that no bell existed. If someone asks me in a hall, "But were they banished?" I will raise my cup and answer as the hall requires. If it is a hall where a boy has died recently for the king's peace, I will say, "Aye, they were." If it is a hall where a man's daughter once wore her hair long and unbound and loved a story about riders on the wind, I will say, "No, the sea simply took them." Both lines are true in their setting, and setting is what most men mean by truth. But if I am left to speak witho, such demands, I return to my harder phrasing because it is the one that cuts least. The realm did not write a banishment. It made one. It made it out of caution and out of fear, out of money and out of sermons, out of the smell of harbors and the silence of corridors. It made it so well that even we who come after would rather pretend we have a document than admit we stand on a shore listening to water. And because we prefer bells to waves, we will continue to ask for the paper I have not found. Perhaps that hunger is our own gentler cruelty, our way of asking the past to be more legible than our choices deserve. There are words a man can speak at the end of such an inquiry that make him sound wiser than he is. He can say that history is a quarrel between what is said and what is done, and he will not be wrong. He can say that the law follows the path of least resistance through the field of custom, and he will not be wrong either. He can say that blood remembers even when ink won't, and many will nod. But I prefer a smaller sentence because small sentences are easier to keep. We wrote less than we did. If I could put that on the lintel of the Red Keep, I would. We wrote less than we did, and what we wrote slant, and the slant spared us the burden of revocation when years softened us. A bell cannot be unrung. A habit can be unlearned. Had we rung the bell, the ending of the tale would have been harsher than it was for those who stayed and harsher than it needed to be for those who went. What happened instead is not clean enough to set a singer's skin tingling, but it is the sort of mess from which a tired realm can rise without tripping. The lesson for those who come after and who will, gods keep them, face their own exiles and their own temptations to harden policies into pronouncements, is not that ambiguity is a virtue in itself. Ambiguity done merely to avoid courage turns to rot. But there are winters when a realm cannot afford the straightest path and summers when mercy must borrow a mask to escape jeers. In those seasons, learn from the men who forbore to write the old house's name. Do not name classes where acts will suffice. Do not name acts where customs will make them unnecessary. Keep faith with the people by refusing to feed them the comfort of bells if what you have is the patience of waves. And when the day comes, because it will, when the pale hair returns, or when some other sign you thought abolished stands suddenly in a square at noon, do not turn to your ledgers for the words to meet it. Turn to your habits, and pray that they are gentler than your fears. I have been accused in friendly corridors of giving too much room to the dignity of men who composed this ambiguity and too little to the sorrow of those who bore it. The charge is fair as far as it goes. The living have a pull on a man's pen that the dead do not, and those early ministers left behind clear lines for a scholar to admire. The exiles left fragments of songs and a lemon tree, and thumbs do not smudge the margins of a memory. So I will lean these last lines into the sorrow. Imagine a woman of the old house. She is not a cipher. She is not a saint. She is a human being who has been told since birth that her blood entitles and damns. Imagine what it is to stand at a quay under a hood and to step onto a ship while discovering that the world is larger and meaner than you were promised. Imagine a boy who learns that the streets of a foreign city can be a game, that names are costumes, that every kindness is a question. Imagine the man who helps them for coin because his wife likes the feel of velvet under her hand, and whose son will be told by a septon 20 years later that he lives in a merciful realm. If you can, give all of them the courtesy of noticing that the policy that shaped their days was not a single word pronounced in glory but 100,000 small refusals, each made by a man who thought he was doing the prudent thing. One could end there, and many would, but endings deserve a last testing, like a knot pulled twice to see if it holds. Have I been too hard on those who wanted a document to point to? Perhaps. A people badly shaken by sack and battle needed a story they could teach their children without making every supper table a court of law. It is not a crime to want to be able to say, "They were banished," and to pass the bread. If you press me, I will confess that I have said the same in rooms where the exactness I have practiced here would have been a cruelty. Truth, like bread, has its proper cutting. But for those who make policy, the larger bread is baked in the ovens of detail and delay, and their obligation is sterner. The next time a realm is tempted to soothe itself with a grand word, let it remember the honest work that word conceals, and let its ministers prefer the humbler task of managing customs to the grander vice of drafting righteousness. Men prefer the taste of being right to the taste of doing well. The banishment that was not is a case when the realm, by accident or wisdom, chose the latter. So, to return to the bell with which I began and from which I turned away, there was no bell. There was the sound of casks rolled down gangplanks at dusk. There was the sound of a seal pressed into wax while a scribe licked his lips and hoped he had not spelled a title wrong. There was the sound of the high septon dropping his voice at a certain line and lifting it at another. There was the sound, later, of children learning the names of kings in a new order while their grandfathers looked at their hands. There was the sound of a coin counted twice and of a raven launched at dawn. Taken together, men heard a bell because bells are easier than all those smaller sounds. But if a careful ear leans close to the past, what it hears is the sea. And the sea, which is itself a collection of small waters moving in complicated obedience to distances men cannot see, says ONL. Why this? The dragon went away because men made it too hard to stay. Whether they should have written that in a fair hand and hung it on a wall is a question for singers. My sympathy is with the clerk who learned to write level, and with the woman under the hood who learned because we made her learn the art of walking quickly without running.